So monks and musicians, these are the best words that I've been able to come up with up to the present anyway, to describe kind of what I've experienced in the Shakuhachi world in terms of the spectrum of approaches. And I mean that as a spectrum, right? You've got monks, you've got musicians, and everybody's a little bit of both. It's just a question of where do you fall on the spectrum. But depending on where you fall, your approach to playing is going to be different. Your sound is going to be different. Your approach to teaching is going to be different. And to some extent, the way you play in your mind and your heart might be a little different. But again, it's one thing I should say at the beginning is neither of these approaches are necessarily more spiritual than the other. There's people who I would qualify as more of the monk approach who are total jerks, and people who I would qualify as more of the musical or musician approach who are really kind people, you know? So I mean, just because you're concerned with spiritual things doesn't mean you're a spiritual person, right? Before I start talking at you too much though, let's give you something to grab onto. So I'm going to play just a little bit of Hon-on first on a modern Giardi flute from a kind of musician style as much as I can, even though it's not really my style so much. And an old style, Edo style Jinashi, the same portion of Hon-on we'll play. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. Let's see if I can do this. I haven't done this for a while. You know, this is a modern Giardi flute. Alright, so yeah, all the pitches are kind of in pitch as much as I'm able to do anyway, and the volume's kind of loud. You got a lot of very clear, even harmonics. Again, not completely my style, so I don't know how well I did that, but I'm gonna play on one of my flutes the same kind of thing. It's gonna be a little bit of a different character, I think. Let's see if I'm able to switch or not. It's nice to see you again. I'll stop there because I don't want to go further. So they're different, right? Approaching as a musician and approaching as a monk is going to sound a little bit different. But first, let's go ahead. Let's talk about the history of this a little bit, okay? So, monks and musicians, it's just not just a modern thing. My idea is that this is kind of a spectrum of personalities and approaches that have existed all through the entire Shakuhachi world throughout history, right? So at the beginning in the Edo era, of course, the leaning is probably more towards the monk side of things, right? Because officially speaking anyway, Shakuhachi is a spiritual practice for Buddhist believers. Of course, not everybody is a believer. Some of them are doing it just to be spies or to kind of get away with their shenanigans or whatever. But I think that we can probably, hopefully, say that there are some genuine, faithful people who are pursuing some sort of truth with their practice as well. So the monk approach is going to be something that, first and foremost, is not concerned with performance. You're not playing for anybody. From my perspective, if anything, you're playing for yourself or you're playing for God. And, when God is my judge, what does it matter what you think? And the great thing is that God doesn't judge the way that people do. So the concern, of course, is not necessarily with making a perfect sound or a beautiful sound, but in this case, shakuhachi is prayer, right? In my thinking, for something to be true prayer, you need to have basically three things. Number one, you need to be doing it. Are you praying or not? Number two, is it honest or not? Is it true, right? If you're not being honest, well, you can't hide anything from God, and really you can't hide anything from yourself either. So if you're not being honest, it's just like communication never happens, and it's not prayer, and it doesn't benefit anybody. And the last thing is, are you listening? Right? It's conversation. I think at Shakuhachi, listening is very important. God will speak if you'll listen. Sometimes God speaks very loudly and clearly, I feel, but if you're not listening, you don't hear it, because there's always something more loud, either in here or out there, that's going on to take your attention off of it. So it's about attention and listening. If you've got those three things, it's prayer. And if you have those three things, it's good. It doesn't matter how it sounds. Sometimes the ugliest sound can be a really beautiful sound because it's showing truth. I mean, look at us, like we're not always beautiful inside. There's a lot inside that's really not beautiful. It becomes beautiful when you're able to share it honestly, and the light of love is shined on it, right? That changes you. I think that's what God does, is change hearts, And I've heard a similar metaphor. Somebody who went to see the Dalai Lama talk said meditation was like the sun shining on the snow on a mountain. And I always kind of liked that metaphor, because I feel like that's kind of what God is like to me. You just, being around God melts the snow so that something real and true and good can show forth, right? I don't know if the metaphor is perfect, but let's get on with that. So monk, right? That's kind of where your mind is at, and your sound is kind of a secondary. It's just a product of what's in here. And if you learn to listen well, even those unbeautiful sounds are actually quite beautiful. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the musician, right? The musician is, first of all, concerned with entertainment. I don't mean to say that in a demeaning way, but if you're a musician, a professional musician, you're playing for people. Sound is going outward, and it's being listened to by people. So you have to be concerned with making a sound that's beautiful. If you don't, your listeners won't like it. You won't become famous, you won't make money, and you'll be poor. Lots of musicians are poor anyway, but you'll be even more poor. So you have to be concerned about making a beautiful sound, and unfortunately you have to be concerned about pleasing people. I think some people who really get to the highest tier of being a musician can also get to the point where they're not playing to please people, and they're really just playing the sound that they like, and that's kind of a point where monk and musician aren't really separate things. I think if you take either path to its extreme, you end up in a similar pace, maybe. But the musician is going to be basically concerned with entertainment, and therefore doesn't have that complete freedom of just playing however she wants to, right? And enjoying that sound, or playing a true sound, right? If you got to put out a pretty face for everybody, you never get to let go of that pain, anger, even sometimes joy and freedom, And man, that's important, You want to be able to do that too. Again, not to say that that's not part of music. So, in the Edo era, I think we still have the musician attitude as well, though, even though the leaning was towards the monk. Back in ancient Japan, you have people who are the head of Shakuhachi temples, right? They're these kind of abbots who are the heads of Shakuhachi temples, and they've generally gained some degree of popularity for themselves. Why? Because people like the way they sound. And again, technically, the Shakuhachi world was for monks, and it was forbidden for lay people or normal people, average people, to play it. But in practice, that wasn't actually the case. Lots of these abbots were making extra money on the side by teaching people Shakuhachi. So that automatically suggests a little bit more of a musical approach to what they're doing, and how did they get popular, right? Again, there's a lot of gray areas here, because what did their sound actually sound like? We've got no recordings from the Edo era. We just don't know. The general leaning, I think, was still towards the monk spectrum of things, so that the sound of Shakuhachi, I think, was not quite in this value system that we have today, with Western pitches being precise. Maybe there were people who had that sense and who were more concerned with that, just as there are today. But some missionaries, I've read books about early Christianity in Japan, and some of the early missionaries in the 1600s came to Japan, and some of them had this very Western musical sense, and the Japanese music to them was just cacophonous. It was like this mishmash of sounds, and it was off key, and they didn't like it. But to other ones who had more of a sense of we really want to love these people as they are, and we want to listen while we're talking. We don't want to just cram our ideas down their throat or anything. These sorts of missionaries found it kind of mysterious and beautiful. There was something different about it that they really liked and was attractive to them. So this idea of being pitch perfect is something that, especially on the monk end of the spectrum, I think it's a lot looser. There's a lot more room for interpretation, and even modern professional Shakuhachi players, some of them will talk about how the older style sound of the Shakuhachi, especially on Shakuhachi with smaller holes, where it's a little bit harder to get those deep meri notes, they give you a different tone that does seem kind of spiritual somehow. It's not quite on pitch, but it's also not wrong either. Somehow when there's confidence behind it, it still sounds right, to me anyway. If you bring that on up to the present, right, of course the leaning has gone the other way because we have such a heavy influence of Western music in our world. Most of what is taught in the Shakuhachi world is something that is either meant to be in pitch, that it already is in pitch, or it's meant to be in pitch. And if it's not in pitch, it's just because the players are tone deaf, not because they're doing anything particularly different. It's still the basis for our judgment is is it a perfect D or not? And your meri, are they daimeri or not? They do this really low meri, but we didn't necessarily have those so much in the Edo era. There's a lot of writings that also suggest the same thing, that talk about how the tsure, the kind of interval, has gotten greater and greater as the tsu has gone deeper, where it used to be a very light tsu, a light tsumeri on that tsure. So on the Edo era, we're on the monk side, and in the modern era, we're in the musician side of things. It's something that has always existed, but the major emphasis has switched. So that's why I feel like it's really important to learn the older way of doing things. It's not about imitating the older way. It's not about trying to figure out what they did because that's the only way that's right, so we can do it now. The thing is that I feel like that's something that's missing from our culture today. The reason I want to study the older way of playing is that especially in a society that's all about noise, all about being right, all about distraction, I kind of want to put that aside and take on an aesthetic that's not quite so in your face, not quite so fancy, not quite so decorated, not quite so loud, but more about tone color, more about nuance, more about breath. And it's the kind of thing you can repeat over and over and over and never get tired of it. This is another feature that I take as the monk approach, right? You've got Gregorian Chant. I don't know if you've heard it before, but this is how I pray just about every day. We sing psalms. You've got very simple melodies that are based on very simple modalities that are actually very similar to the Shakuhachi modes as well. And they, rather than just being major, happy, minor, sad, there's this whole spectrum of 8 modes that are kind of, you can't tell what they are. It's the same with Shakuhachi music too, I think. They adapt to you however you are that day. They're different every day. And because of these classics, because of that depth, you can play the same song every day and never get tired of it. With a modern song, like, Britney Spears song, if you remember Britney Spears, does that date me? You listen to her once and you're like, wow, that's great. Not that I ever thought that, but some people do, right? And twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, you get sick of it pretty quickly. Whereas with the classics, you start out by, it's not so special. You listen again, you listen more, and you start to go deeper and deeper into it, and you find that there's this like kind of infinite sea of mystery in this one little piece, and it changes with you every day. And I mean, like Meister Eckhart said, that God is the newest thing there is. There's this like, it's new always. It's always new. And it's that newness that is in the oldness. That's why I look at the old things, because there's something brand new. There's something newer than the newest thing that's right in there. And isn't that special? The other thing that's going to affect, now I'm going to talk about teaching, right? So I talked about the sound, of course, at the beginning. We talked about what's different in your mind and about the history of these different approaches. But what about when you teach? And again, this is one of the biggest differences for me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal story with the shakuhachi here. I started off meeting shakuhachi as an instrument of prayer. I had no teacher. I just made one out of PVC, and I was playing it for the first 2 or 3 years of my shakuhachi career. I just go out into the woods and play, and it was a time of great, I was a teenager, okay? That's like, why must I be a teenager in love? It was that, yeah. I'm so glad I'm not that anymore. Man, that really sucked sometimes. But there's so much turmoil in your heart, and like plus dealing with girlfriends and dealing with like trying to figure out what is true, and like I've had this kind of faith that I was raised with, but I was like, what, I don't think I can believe this. So I threw out Christianity for a while, and like there was so much going on. Shakuhachi, I brought into the woods, I'd play, I'd feel my feelings that I didn't even know that I had would be coming out, and I really started to meet God there. It brought me to a different place, and I really appreciated that. So for me, shakuhachi was about prayer. It was about truth in the innermost being, like Psalm 51 says. That's what God likes, is truth in the innermost being. It's about letting go of what's in there, and what seems kind of like a rough and strange sound, atonal sound, becomes a very beautiful sound, both in the sound itself and in the heart that's listening to it. From there, my first teacher was also a Christian, and she was very influential in my life, Patricia. And after that, my teachers were also, Zen laymen. And, what I appreciated especially about Suiko Sensei is that he still respected, we would talk about Jesus and Buddha, and there's important differences, and my approach to shakuhachi is a little bit different, but he still respected that. And his approach to shakuhachi playing, though, was, it's technical. There's techniques, so it is technical to some extent. But it's mostly about playing together and the pleasure of playing together. After every lesson, it was just good. Because that's all you can say, and it's true. It was good. It was always good. There's no evaluation apart from that, like I talked about before. Having been in that world for like 15 or 16 years, at a certain point I was like, I need to know a little bit about the modern shakuhachi world too. So I borrowed a Giardi shakuhachi, and I started taking lessons in the KSK, the Yokoyama tradition. And I'm not saying it was bad or anything. It was just like totally different, and it really gave me an idea of what I had been doing, because now at our lessons, it was about like, how do you do this? Is your pitch right? Is your technique right? Are you getting enough harmonics out of that sound? How do you adjust your fingers? It's all about, again, modern shakuhachi is about playing with your fingers. So your shakuhachi has to be perfectly in tune too. So the instrument that you're using is different. And it's got these big finger holes, and it's for making kind of a louder sound so you can help people listen to it and hear it. it's a different instrument. Really, to me, these are totally different instruments, and even the same piece is a totally different thing on both of them. And again, I've talked about that a little bit more on other videos, but this experience really showed me that, like, wow, this is really a musician approach. It's about the musical side of things. It's not about the heart so much. And again, all of us probably emphasize both to a certain extent. It's just, where is your emphasis? Is it more on the musical side of things, or is it more on the heart? And that's not to say that one side ignores the other. It's just that they're different enough that we can give them different names, I think. And that is something for me that has helped me understand both of them. And finally, I wanted to talk to you about that idea of entertainment that I talked about at the beginning, right? The biggest difference I can see is that the musician needs to entertain. The monk is free to just be himself. It's not about better or worse. It's just like, which do you want to do? I really like that kind of freedom of being myself and being honest in my sound and not worrying what people think about it. So that's kind of the approach that I've chosen. And again, it's also an approach where with this, your energy is going out. You're kind of broadcasting it to people, right? With this, it's prayer, so that listening aspect also becomes really important. Kind of blending into the background of the sounds around me. Listening at the same time that I'm playing. If somebody is around, maybe they hear it, maybe they don't. Maybe they hear it and want to come closer. Maybe they just walk on by. But that's all it is. It's not going out. It's actually kind of drawing in for people who are listening, right? I think that is a major difference, and it's not an absolute difference, but it is a difference. And if you've listened to this and your approach is one or the other, you've probably found things to relate to in both of them. And you might have thought like, hey, well, that's me, not me. Or like, hey, I play Yokoyama School, but I actually listen, while I'm playing. I know that the late Ronnie Selden sometimes talked about when he was playing, he would look for a person in the audience who was listening and play just for that person, because you'd feel his music going into that person. And he's an example of somebody who I'd consider more of a modern style shakuhachi player. He played Giari flutes, he learned from Yamaguchi Goro. At the same time, he's got some of the monk approach in him too, obviously. So it's not a clear-cut thing. But it's nice to enjoy shakuhachi in the way that's enjoyable to you, because it's not something that you have to do. So you might as well do it in a way that you enjoy.